I could feel the weight of the room before I even heard the words. It was one of those restaurants where the lighting is just dim enough to make everyone look a little more polished than they are, where the tablecloths are so white they almost glow, and where conversations are usually kept to a low, cultured hum. But not tonight. Not at our table. Not with my brother. "She's dead weight," he said, his voice cutting through the clink of cutlery and the delicate murmur of other diners. He wasn't even trying to lower his tone. "Just takes up space." The words landed like cold stones on my plate, harder because of the way they were delivered, so casually, so effortlessly, as though they were not cruel, but simply factual. He didn't glance at me when he said it. He looked at his wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid in slow, lazy circles. And then, because there's always an audience for this sort of thing, his eyes flicked to his wife, waiting for the shared smirk. It came on cue. It wasn't the first time he'd spoken about me like I wasn't there. It probably wouldn't be the last. My family had a way of pretending that their most cutting remarks were simply harmless observations. The trick, you see, is to deliver them with a laugh or in the middle of a story so it seems like everyone's in on the joke. Everyone except the target. Tonight, I was the target, as usual. I felt the heat creeping into my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the simmering effort it took not to react. I had learned a long time ago that reacting only fed them. They lived for the performance of it. My hurt, my protests, my attempts to explain myself. It gave them material, so I didn't give them any. The server, a young man in a neatly pressed shirt with a nervous smile, approached the table with a tray of entrees balanced expertly on his arm. For a moment, his arrival pulled the attention away from me, but not the tension. He set down the plates with quiet efficiency, retreating as quickly as he came. I envied him. The table shifted back into idle chatter, as though my brother's words had simply evaporated into the candle-lit air. My mother reached for the salt without meeting my eyes. My sister-in-law adjusted her napkin and began talking about their upcoming vacation to Greece. My father checked his watch, the very picture of disinterest. They had all heard him. They had all chosen not to care. I stared at the slow swirl of sauce around the edge of my plate, letting their voices fade into a kind of background noise. My hands rested lightly in my lap, fingers intertwined, posture straight. I've always believed that dignity is something you carry, especially when others try to strip it from you. Tonight, it was my armor. And then, just as I was deciding whether to force myself through a few polite bites or simply excuse myself entirely, the restaurant's front doors opened. The sound was subtle, barely audible, over the clinking of glasses, but my ears caught it. I glanced up. A man in a crisp pilot's uniform stepped inside. He paused near the entrance, scanning the room with the easy confidence of someone used to finding people in crowded spaces. The gold stripes on his sleeves caught the light as he moved. His eyes passed over tables quickly, assessing, searching, and then they landed on me. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by the smallest nod. He began walking toward our table, his stride purposeful but unhurried. Heads turned as he passed because of the uniform, the bearing, the quiet authority that seemed to come with him like a shadow. When he reached me, he stopped just to my left. His voice was calm, professional, and pitched, so the whole table, and likely the neighboring ones, could hear. "Ma'am," he said, "your plane is ready." The air at the table shifted just slightly, a ripple of curiosity. I could feel my brother's gaze on me now, sharp and searching. The pilot continued, "We're fueled and filed, and the crew is on standby. If we leave in the next 20 minutes, we'll stay ahead of that weather system coming in from the west." I met his eyes and gave a small, measured smile. "Thank you. I'll be right out." He nodded once and turned, heading back toward the door. The hum of conversation in the restaurant resumed, but our table had gone strangely still. I reached for my napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my plate. I didn't rush. I didn't fumble. I simply stood, adjusting the sleeves of my jacket. My brother finally spoke, his voice quieter now, tinged with something new. Confusion. "Your plane?" I glanced at him, letting the pause stretch just long enough for him to feel it. Then I gave him a small, almost polite smile. "Enjoy dinner." I didn't wait for a reply. I turned and walked toward the door, the soft tap of my heels on the hardwood floor the only sound I cared to hear. Behind me, I could feel his stare follow me the entire way. He didn't speak for the rest of dinner, and I didn't need him to. Earlier that day, I had told myself this meal would be nothing more than a courtesy, a final nod to a family obligation I'd long since outgrown. But the truth was, the moment I stepped into that restaurant, I knew something was going to change. I just didn't know it would start here, under these dim lights with my brother's voice dripping disdain, and end somewhere far above the clouds. The runway was waiting, and so was the rest of the story. By the time the pilot's footsteps had faded into the night and the restaurant door swung shut behind me, I could still hear the echo of my brother's voice in my head, not because the insult hurt, but because of how predictable it had been. This dinner was never about catching up. It was about ceremony. My mother's word, not mine. She'd called me 3 weeks ago, her tone brisk but measured, like she was inviting me to something she knew I might decline. "We're all going to meet at Le Foyer," she'd said, as though the choice of the most expensive restaurant in the city might sweeten the deal. "Your brother's been promoted. It's a big step for him." I'd almost laughed. Not because the promotion wasn't significant. It was. He'd been angling for that title for years. But the "we're all going" part? That was the real performance. Family gatherings in my world came with a script, and my role had been written decades ago. The truth? I nearly said no. I could have claimed a scheduling conflict. Heaven knows I have plenty of those. But something in her voice stopped me. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't excitement. It was expectation. The unspoken, familiar kind that said, "Be there and behave yourself." So I agreed. Le Foyer was one of those places where the lighting seemed designed to hide the years and flaws on its patrons' faces. Muted gold sconces, a single candle flickering in the center of each table, and the kind of background music that you never really notice until it stops. The dining room smelled faintly of rosemary and butter, but under it all was the sharper scent of polish. On the wood floors, the brass fixtures, the image. I'd arrived exactly on time, as I always did, walking in to find them already seated. My brother at the head of the table, of course. His wife, immaculate as ever, to his right. My mother sitting beside her, pearls at her throat, posture perfect. My father across from her, shoulders still squared with that military precision, even though he's been retired for decades. I slid into the empty chair beside my father, my jacket still buttoned, my purse placed neatly on the floor. It didn't take long before the conversation turned to my brother's news, his new title, his expanded responsibilities, the travel it would require. He told the story like he was giving an acceptance speech, careful to make it sound both grand and humble, all while sprinkling in the occasional joke that put himself in just the right light. When the server came for our orders, I kept mine simple. "The salmon, please," I said, folding the menu and handing it back with a small smile. My brother ordered the filet, rare, and a bottle of the Pinot he liked to pretend he'd discovered. They were mid-discussion about the wine list when my phone buzzed softly in my jacket pocket. I slipped it out under the table, the glow from the screen lighting my hands. One new message: FBO Tower, filed IFR 2115, crew ready, weather window tightening, recommend departure on schedule. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket without responding. Not yet. I'd made a point of silencing my work when I was with them, not because they respected it, they didn't, but because I refused to give them the satisfaction of knowing anything about it until I chose the moment. That message, though, that was the ticking clock. We'd have to be airborne soon to beat the front coming in from the west. My brother was leaning back in his chair now, one arm draped over the backrest, smiling as he recounted some meeting where he'd steered the ship in the right direction. My mother beamed at him like he'd personally rescued the company from disaster. His wife nodded along, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. I sipped my water, letting their words wash over me. This was my family in their most comfortable pose. Him as the golden sun, them as his audience. And me? I was the polite silence at the table, the one whose life they could fill in with whatever story they preferred. Tonight I had no intention of correcting them. Instead, I focused on the details around me, the way the candlelight caught the edge of my wine glass, the faint hiss of the espresso machine at the bar, the crisp fold of my napkin across my lap. I found myself cataloging the small, quiet things, the details no one else noticed, my way of anchoring myself while the current of their conversation pulled elsewhere. Every so often, my father would glance my way, as though checking to see if I was still following along. When I'd meet his eyes, he'd give the faintest nod before looking back at my brother. It wasn't hostility. Not exactly. It was habit. We all knew our places here. The food arrived, plated like art, each dish crowned with a flourish of herbs. I thanked the server by name, Evan, I'd noticed on his tag, and watched his expression shift slightly like it meant something to him that someone had bothered. I'd just taken my first bite when my brother's voice cut clean through the room. She's dead weight. Just takes up space. He didn't look at me when he said it. That was the trick, you see. Deliver it sideways like it's just part of the flow, so no one can call it an attack. But I knew it was. And I knew something else, too. The night wasn't going to end here, with his words hanging in the air like smoke. It was going to end when I walked out of this room, when the soft whine of turbine engines would cut through the night and lift me far above everything they thought they knew about me. I let the insult pass without a blink, took another bite of salmon, and let my mind move ahead to the runway lights, waiting in the dark. The clock was still ticking, and the weather was still coming. The thing about being dismissed isn't that it happens once. It's that it happens so often in so many small ways that you start to anticipate it before it comes. Even as I sat there at Le Foyer cutting into my salmon with slow, deliberate movements, my mind drifted back to all the other tables where I'd been served the same dish, just with different seasoning. The first memory that surfaced was of my 10th birthday. My mother had planned a big family picnic in the park, the kind with red and white checked blankets and baskets full of sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She'd invited all the neighborhood families, and for the first hour or so, I'd been certain the day was about me. Then my brother, 3 years younger and already good at stealing the spotlight, without even trying, spotted an empty patch of grass and decided to show off his new soccer tricks. People gathered around him like iron filings to a magnet. The oohs and ahs followed every kick, every spin. When the cake came out, my cake, half the group was still cheering for him. He even blew out one of my candles while helping. I laughed it off at the time, but later, sitting alone in my room with the balloon my aunt had given me, I realized no one had asked me what I'd wished for. Years later, in high school, it was the awards banquet. I'd won the regional science competition, first place for a project that had taken me months of after-school work in the lab, learning coding languages my teacher barely understood. The principal handed me a plaque, shook my hand, and moved on to the next student without much fanfare. But when my brother's soccer team made it to the state finals that same year, the whole school threw a pep rally. Teachers painted banners. There was a send-off parade. I told myself it was different. Sports were easier to celebrate because everyone could understand them. A science fair win? That was quieter. Still, somewhere deep down, I knew the truth. My achievements just didn't fit their picture of success. It didn't get better as we grew up. When I landed my first job after college, a logistics coordinator for a small air freight company, I was thrilled. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a foot in the door for what I wanted to do. I'd been obsessed with aviation since I was 12, when a pilot at a community air show let me sit in the cockpit of a Cessna and explained the instrument panel to me like I was an equal. I never forgot the hum of possibility I felt in that seat. At Sunday dinner that week, I told my family the news. My brother nodded once and said, "So, you're like a secretary for pilots?" My father chuckled. My mother said, "That's nice, dear. Have you met anyone at work yet?" They didn't ask what the job entailed. They didn't want to know about the scheduling algorithms I'd been learning or how quickly I'd picked up ICAO codes. They wanted to keep me in a neat, manageable category: support staff, background noise. The more I tried to share, the quicker they were to change the subject. After a while, I stopped trying. I learned to keep my victories to myself. But there were moments I couldn't hide, like the first time I coordinated an emergency medevac flight in my second year. A car accident in a remote county had left a teenager with injuries too severe for the local hospital to handle. I spent an hour on the phone lining up pilots, clearing weather checks, and securing a landing slot at a trauma center 3 states away. The flight made it in just under the wire, beating a wall of storms by 15 minutes. The boy lived. The next week, I visited my parents for dinner. My brother was there, talking about his latest work trip, some conference in Chicago, I think. My father asked him half a dozen questions about it, leaning forward with genuine interest. When my turn came, I told them, "We had a medevac last week. We got the patient in just before the storm hit." My mother smiled politely. "Oh, that's nice. Was it busy after that?" That was it. No follow-up, no, "How did you do it?" No, "What was that like?" Just a nod and the same glazed look people get when they're waiting for you to finish so they can move on. I realized then that in their minds, my job would never be more than a set of polite, unimportant errands. It's a strange thing to build a life where the people closest to you know the least about what you actually do. Stranger still when they don't want to know. So I stopped inviting them in. I built my own walls, not of bitterness, at least not entirely, but of self-preservation. I learned to give them the version of me they preferred, the quiet one, the one they could underestimate without challenge, because there's a certain power in being underestimated. And as I sat there in that expensive dining room, the smell of rosemary and seared meat heavy in the air, listening to my brother bask in his own curated spotlight, I felt that old familiar power humming beneath the surface. It had been my shield for years, but tonight it was going to be my weapon. I didn't know exactly when the moment would come. I just knew it was on its way, faster than any of them could imagine. People think the word logistics means schedules and spreadsheets. My family certainly does. They picture me in some beige cubicle, answering emails about cargo delays and making coffee runs for the real workers. They have no idea what my office actually looks like. It's not beige. It's steel and glass, tucked inside a secure hangar on the edge of the regional airport, a building without signs or visitor parking. The windows are tinted, the access doors controlled by biometric scans. Step inside and you feel it, the temperature drop, the faint vibration of machinery running somewhere deep in the walls, the low hum of servers stacked in climate-controlled rooms. The air smells faintly of aviation fuel and fresh coffee, the 2 lifebloods of my world. From my desk, a solid slab of metal and composite, not a particle board relic, I can see the floor of the operations center. Screens line the far wall, each one streaming live data. Doppler radar overlays, MEDAR and TAF updates for every airfield we touch. Satellite images showing weather systems curling like great slow storms across continents. Another display shows aircraft positions as tiny green blips inching across a map, each one tagged with its call sign, altitude, and speed. To the untrained eye, it might look like chaos. To me, it's a living thing. Every number, every moving dot, every color shift in the radar feed is a signal. My job is to read them, understand them, and act before anyone else realizes the picture has changed. We're not moving vacationers or shipping flowers. My operation specializes in critical transport, emergency medevacs, organ deliveries, disaster relief supplies, personnel extractions. In my world, there are no minor delays. A delay can mean a life is lost, a surgery is canceled, a relief convoy is stranded in a storm. I don't just schedule flights. I run a constantly shifting chessboard where the pieces are aircraft, pilots, mechanics, and the laws of nature. The enemy is time. The night before this dinner, I was here until 3:15 a.m. coordinating an emergency lift from a wildfire zone 3 states away. The fire had jumped a containment line, trapping a rural hospital in a valley filling with smoke. Their backup generators were failing. They had 7 patients on ventilators. We got the call at 21:42. By 21:50, I had 2 King Airs fueled and crews en route. By 22:12, I'd filed clearances and secured priority handling with the FAA. At 22:40, I was on a conference line with state emergency services, advising on evacuation routes to get ambulances to the airstrip before the smoke-reduced visibility below VFR minimums. At 23:06, the first aircraft was airborne. At 00:31, the last patient was loaded onto the second plane. Both cleared the valley minutes before a wall of smoke rolled over the airfield. I stayed on comms until they were safely on the ground at our partner hospital. When the final wheels down came through, I sat back for the first time in hours. My eyes burned from staring at screens. My shoulders ached from holding still. I shut everything down and walked out into the dark hangar. The planes were still warm, the engines ticking as they cooled. The smell of hot oil and fuel hung in the air. Somewhere far off, a single bird called into the night. That's what they call nothing when they talk about my job. They have no idea how many flights I've turned in the middle of a storm, how many crews I've rerouted to dodge icing at 15,000 feet, how many pilots have looked at me after a mission and said, "We made it because of your call." And that's fine. For the most part, I don't need them to know. My satisfaction comes from the sound of wheels touching down, from the quiet confirmation that someone made it because I stayed calm when the sky turned hostile. But sometimes the secrecy stops feeling like dignity and starts feeling like erasure. The irony is that the people I work with never underestimate me. Pilots, dispatchers, medics, they know exactly what I do. They know how many moving parts I keep in the air at once. They trust my voice in their ear when the weather is turning and the options are running out. It's everyone else, especially my family, that thinks I spend my days shuffling papers and sipping coffee. They imagine I'm invisible because they've decided not to look. A few days before this dinner, I was standing in the same room when my chief pilot came in with a message. "Got a call from FBO Tower," he said. "They want to confirm we're still set for the late departure Friday night." I raised an eyebrow. "Friday night? Your flight," he said. "Your wheels up after dinner, right? I told them we'd file it and keep the crew ready." It took me a second to remember. Of course. The plan had been in place for weeks. Finish the family dinner, drive to the hangar, and be airborne before the weather closed in. The mission was straightforward. A scheduled supply run to a clinic in a rural stretch of the Midwest, beating a storm system to get in and out before the roads flooded. It was important work, and it was mine. I checked the time, did the math backward, and knew immediately how the evening would have to flow. I'd need to leave the restaurant on schedule, no matter what happened at that table. Which is why, when my phone buzzed under the table at Le Foyer with that weather update, I didn't flinch. The runway was already calling me, and the sky waits for no one, not even my brother's arrogance. Of all the flights I've coordinated, there's one that plays in my head like a film I can't turn off. It happened 4 winters ago, during what the news later called the Ice Veil Storm. The system had started as a typical cold front sweeping down from Canada, but over the Great Plains it had gathered moisture, then stalled over the Midwest. Temperatures plunged, rain turned to sleet, sleet to freezing rain, and the world began to glaze over. I was at the hangar before dawn that day, the metal of the door handle biting cold through my gloves. The tarmac was already slick underfoot, every parked aircraft wearing a sheen of frost like it had been dipped in glass. The call came in at 6:27 a.m. A children's hospital 2 states over had a heart transplant scheduled for a 6-year-old boy. The donor heart was in a facility nearly 800 miles away, and every commercial route had been grounded due to icing and low visibility. They needed someone who could move fast, make decisions on the fly, and keep the chain of custody airtight. I didn't hesitate. Within minutes, I was at my console, headset on, eyes moving between the weather feeds and the fleet tracker. 2 aircraft were in range, a King Air 350 based 90 miles north and a Pilatus PC-12 that had landed from a charter run less than an hour earlier. The King Air had more range, but the Pilatus was already on our ramp and fueled to 70%. We didn't have time to position the King Air. Every minute mattered. I got the Pilatus captain on comms. "We've got a transplant run, 6-year-old recipient. Heart in storage in Bismarck, North Dakota. Weather's closing in everywhere along the route. You up for it?" He didn't even pause. "Send me the file. We'll fly it." While he ran pre-flight, I was working 3 channels at once, calling ahead to secure priority clearance from ATC, arranging a ground courier to meet the aircraft in Bismarck, and lining up a second crew to take over halfway if conditions deteriorated. The storm was moving east faster than predicted, so I plotted a dogleg route south, then west, skirting the worst icing bands. The extra 100 miles would cost us time, but it would keep them in safer air. At 7:42, the Pilatus lifted off. I watched the blip on my screen climb, level and turn southwest, slipping between 2 walls of blue and pink on the radar. For the next 3 hours, I barely moved. The ops floor was silent except for the low murmur of other coordinators working their own flights. Every few minutes, I'd check in with the crew, adjusting headings by a few degrees to avoid the heaviest returns. At 10:59, I got the call. "Cargo on board." The heart was packed in a temperature-controlled case, sealed and tagged. The courier handed it over to the flight nurse, who secured it in the cabin. But the weather was already shifting again. The route I'd planned for the return leg was now under a fresh advisory. Freezing drizzle and surface temps dropping like a stone. If we didn't get them above the layer fast, we risked losing the whole mission. I pulled up wind charts, scanning for any corridor of clear air. Found one, narrow, over the river valley, but it meant threading the needle between 2 converging systems. I patched into the cockpit. "You're going to see some moderate chop for 5 minutes. Trust me, it'll be smooth once you're through. Climb to flight level 240 and hold heading 215 until I give you the turn." The captain's reply was steady. "Copy, climbing." I watched their ground speed tick upward, then saw the radar ahead clear just enough for the turn. 245 now, I told him. They broke into open sky like a swimmer surfacing from dark water. We landed them at the Children's Hospital's partner airfield with 48 minutes to spare. The surgical team was waiting on the ramp. They wheeled the heart straight from the aircraft to the ambulance, lights flashing in the falling snow. The boy's surgery started within the hour. The heart took. He lived. I didn't cry, never do in the moment. But when the call came the next day that he was awake and asking for a popsicle, I sat at my desk for a long time just looking at the screens, listening to the hum of the servers. That's my work. The work my family thinks is moving paper around. They've never seen me in that role, the one with her. Voice in the pilot's ear, guiding them through the storm, watching the clock like it's a fuse burning down. They've never felt the weight of knowing that a decision you make in 15 seconds can save or cost someone's life. I don't tell them these stories anymore. I've learned they prefer their version of me, small, harmless, easy to ignore. But as I sat in that restaurant, with the taste of salmon on my tongue and my brother's insult still hanging in the air, I thought about that boy and all the other people whose lives had intersected with mine at 30,000 feet. And I thought, let him have his moment. Mine is coming. The funny thing about people underestimating you is that it works best for them when everyone does it. All it takes is one person in the room who knows the truth, and suddenly the narrative isn't as airtight as they thought. In my world, that person is James Jim Calder, a man with 40 years in the air under his belt, a logbook that could be published as an adventure novel, and a way of speaking that made even the most chaotic operations briefing sound like an old friend telling you a story over coffee. Jim's my chief pilot now, but before that he flew bush planes in Alaska, medevac choppers in Afghanistan, and relief cargo into places most people can't find on a map. He has seen the full spectrum of what aviation can be, both the glory and the grind. He's also one of the few people who's watched me work from start to finish on a high-stakes run. He's seen the map spread across my desk at 3 in the morning, the way my hands move from screen to radio to notebook without hesitation. He knows the voice I use when I'm guiding a plane through a corridor of clear air that only exists for a handful of minutes. 3 days before the dinner at Le Foyer, Jim walked into my office with his flight jacket slung over his shoulder and a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Got a call from the Foundation," he said. I looked up from my screen. "Which one?" "The Humanitarian Aviation Alliance. They're giving you the Lifetime Contribution Award next quarter." He tossed a small envelope onto my desk. "Formal invites in there, black tie event, big room full of people who actually understand what you do." I blinked at him. I didn't even know I was nominated. "You weren't," he said, leaning on the edge of my desk. "Not officially. I put your name in." That stopped me. "Jim?" He waved it off. "Don't start. You've been running these ops for 15 years, and half the people who've gotten this award have done less with more resources. It's about time your name's on something public." I picked up the envelope, sliding my thumb under the flap but not opening it. "You know my family." "I do," he said, cutting me off gently. "And I also know they're not going to be in that ballroom, which is probably why you'll actually enjoy it." I smiled despite myself. Then he added, "By the way, the crew's filed for your Friday night run. Weather's shifting faster than the models predicted, so we're keeping the window tight." I nodded. "I'll be there." That's how Jim is, sliding seamlessly from something personal to something operational, because in our line of work, the two aren't separate. But there was more in his tone that day, a subtle weight under the casual delivery. I knew him well enough to recognize it. "What's on your mind?" I asked. He straightened, running a hand over the back of his neck. "Nothing urgent, just be ready for questions Friday night." I frowned. "Questions from who?" He smiled again, but this time there was something sharper behind it. "Let's just say people pay attention when a uniformed pilot walks into a fancy restaurant asking for you by name." I raised an eyebrow. "Jim, you'll see," he said, already heading for the door. He left me with the kind of non-answer that's more of a promise than an evasion. That's the thing about pilots. They're used to working in a world where timing is everything, and they know when not to spoil the surprise. Friday came faster than I expected. By the time I'd finished my morning briefings and signed off on the supply manifests for the next 3 days, it was early afternoon. I stood in the hangar watching the maintenance crew work on the Pilatus that would be my ride later that night. She was a clean white bird with a single silver stripe down her fuselage, the kind of plane that didn't look flashy until you saw her climb. I knew every inch of her, every sound her engine made, every quirk in her avionics. Jim was in the cockpit running pre-checks, his headset slung around his neck. He glanced down when he saw me and called out, "Fuel's at 90%. We're good to go whenever you are." I walked closer, resting a hand on the smooth curve of the fuselage. "I'll be wheels up by 10 at the latest. Keep her warm." He gave me a small salute, but his eyes held that same unspoken something I'd seen earlier in the week. "Don't be late to the party, boss, and I don't mean the flight." By now, I knew better than to press. That night, walking into Le Foyer, I'd been ready for the usual. Polite greetings, a few barbed comments, a slow dinner I'd sit through while thinking about the flight ahead. I hadn't expected the insult to come so early, or to cut quite so neatly into the conversation like it had been rehearsed. "She's dead weight, just takes up space." I'd kept my face still, my voice quiet, because I'd already learned the best counter to a cheap shot is to let the shooter think they've hit their mark. right up until they realize they've missed entirely. And then I heard the door open, the sound of purposeful footsteps. Jim. Not in his leather flight jacket this time, but in full uniform. Dark slacks, pressed white shirt, gold wings pinned above his left pocket, the 4 bars on his shoulders catching the candlelight. The other diners didn't know him, but they reacted anyway. That's what happens when someone carries themselves like they belong in command. He scanned the room, eyes locking on me immediately. And when he reached the table, his voice was calm, steady, pitched just loud enough to carry. "Ma'am, your plane is ready." I didn't have to look at my brother to know his expression had changed. I could feel the shift in the air, and in that moment I understood exactly what Jim had been hinting at all week. The stage wasn't mine to set. It was mine to walk onto. By the time the waiter poured the first round of wine, I could already feel the lines being drawn. Family dinners in my world are never neutral ground. They're terrain my brother knows how to navigate like a general walking a battlefield he's memorized. The table itself was the map. He at the head, his wife on his right flank, my parents arrayed in positions that gave them easy lines of sight to each other and me. On the far side, close enough to hear every word but far enough to be excluded from the quiet asides and glances that passed between them. It started the way these things always do, with questions that aren't really questions. "So," my mother began, smoothing the edge of her napkin as if that task required surgical precision, "how have you been keeping busy?" The phrasing was deliberate. Not "what have you been working on?" or "how's the company?" Just keeping busy, like I was an elderly neighbor with too much time on her hands. "I've been well," I said evenly, resisting the urge to fill the silence that followed. Years ago, I would have rushed to give examples, to prove I was doing something worthy. Now, I let the quiet hang. My brother rescued her from it. "She's always been good at staying out of trouble," he said, his tone light, but his eyes already scanning the wine list again, as if my life could be summed up in a single offhand comment. His wife, Elaine, leaned in. "It must be nice, though, not having the stress of a real job. I envy you sometimes." A real job. There it was. I smiled faintly, keeping my hand steady on the stem of my glass. "It has its moments," I said. My father cleared his throat. "Elaine's right, you know. Stress will kill you quicker than anything. I tell your brother all the time, slow down, but you know him. Always chasing the next big thing." They laughed, and I sipped my water. The food orders were taken, and as the menus were collected, the conversation shifted to their travel plans. A trip to Greece next month, then possibly Italy in the spring if schedules allowed. My mother's eyes lit up as she described the villa they'd booked. My brother described it, too, though from his mouth it sounded less like a vacation and more like a diplomatic mission. "Of course," he added, "we had to upgrade the flights. Elaine can't stand being crammed into those tiny seats in economy." I didn't bite. My seat tonight and later was already guaranteed to have more legroom than they could imagine. As the first course arrived, cream of asparagus soup served in delicate porcelain bowls, the small talk took on a sharper edge. "So," my brother began, setting down his spoon after the first taste, "how's the, what do you call it, operations thing? Still doing the same routes?" He knew exactly what I called it, but pretending not to remember was part of the performance. "We've had a few changes," I said. "Weather's been challenging this month." "Ah." He nodded, as though that explained everything. "Well, I suppose someone has to keep an eye on that sort of thing." His tone was neutral to the untrained ear, but I could hear the subtext. That sort of thing. Not important. Not substantial. My mother glanced at me then, a flicker of something like pity in her eyes. "At least it keeps you busy," she said softly. I caught my father watching me, not with pity, but with that detached assessment he always seemed to have when measuring whether I was meeting the unspoken standards of the table. Under the table, my phone buzzed once, a vibration I recognized instantly. I shifted my hand just enough to glance at the screen. Jim. Filed and ready. WX window is holding. Crew in position. I set the phone back down, my expression unchanged. Timing was everything. The soup bowls were cleared, the main courses brought in on silver trays. The salmon in front of me glistened under the low light. My brother's steak bled onto the plate in the way he liked. The conversation lulled for a moment, the only sounds the clink of cutlery and the murmur of the pianist in the corner. And then, as if the silence had been waiting for him, my brother spoke. "She's dead weight. Just takes up space." The words were soft enough that they might have been missed at another table, but here, in this perfect little theater, they landed with precision. Elaine's lips curled just slightly. My mother busied herself with the salt shaker. My father's jaw tightened, not in defense of me, but at the idea of a scene being made. I didn't move, didn't flinch, because Jim was already walking through the front door. The moment before impact is always quiet. In aviation, it's the stillness right before the wheels touch the runway. At sea, it's the pause before the bow hits the wave. Here, it was the hushed shift of the room as a man in uniform stepped inside. He scanned, found me, and walked forward with the purposeful ease of someone who belongs in every space he enters. "Ma'am," he said when he reached the table, "your plane is ready. Weather's shifting. We should depart within 20. Every head at the table turned toward me. My brother's smirk faltered, replaced by something more uncertain. Elaine's eyes narrowed. My mother blinked rapidly. I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and stood. "Thank you," I said to Jim. Then I looked at my brother, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the point. "Enjoy dinner." And I turned toward the door. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a disruption in a place like Le Foyer. It's not the absence of noise. It's the way voices drop just enough to make room for the thing everyone wants to hear more clearly. I could feel it now. As I stepped back from the table, my chair sliding in without a sound, I was aware of dozens of eyes turning in my direction. Not all at once. People are too polite for that. But in small, staggered glances. A couple at a table near the bar paused mid-conversation. The sommelier froze halfway to the wine rack. Even the pianist hesitated over his next chord. I adjusted my jacket, not rushing, letting the moment breathe. My fingers found the single button at the waist and fastened it. The fabric settled against me like a second skin, dark, tailored, and deliberately chosen to be both understated and precise. Jim stepped slightly aside, clearing the path. "We'll have the car brought around," he murmured. I nodded once, then turned to face the table one last time. My brother's fork was still poised over his plate, a morsel of steak speared and forgotten. His eyes were locked on me, the earlier smugness gone, replaced by a flicker of something he couldn't quite disguise, uncertainty, maybe even the beginning of understanding. Elaine sat stiffly, her hands folded too neatly on the linen, as if trying to prove she wasn't rattled. My mother looked at me with a kind of startled politeness, like she was seeing a stranger she vaguely recognized. My father's face was unreadable, but his jaw was set in that way it always was when he realized he wasn't controlling the narrative. I gave them a small, courteous nod, not the kind you offer an apology, but the kind you give to people who have just been moved from one category in your life to another. "Enjoy dinner," I said again, my tone calm enough to feel like a dismissal. And then I walked. The floorboards carried the sound of my heels in a soft, even rhythm. A waiter with a tray of champagne stepped aside, his eyes flicking to the 4 gold stripes on Jim's shoulder, then back to me. At the door, the maitre d' straightened, as if I'd just been promoted to someone worth his full attention. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected, the early night breeze curling around my collar. The valet stand came into view, and as soon as they spotted us, a young man in a dark blazer jogged toward the drive. "Your vehicle's here, ma'am," he said, his voice pitched low. with a kind of deference you don't get from small talk. The car that pulled up wasn't ostentatious, a deep charcoal sedan, polished to a mirror finish, with tinted windows and a subtle emblem on the grille. The rear door opened without me touching the handle. Jim moved to the driver's side, speaking briefly with the man behind the wheel before sliding into the front passenger seat. I ducked into the back, the scent of leather and faint citrus cleaner greeting me as I settled in. The door closed with that satisfying solid sound of precision engineering. Through the glass, I caught one last glimpse of the restaurant's facade. In one of the tall windows, I could just make out my family's table, a blur of figures caught mid-conversation that was no longer about the promotion they'd gathered to celebrate. The car eased forward, pulling away from the glow of the street lamps into the quieter roads that led toward the airport. We didn't talk much during the drive. Jim glanced back once. "Weather's holding for now," he said. "Winds are picking up from the west, so we'll take off heading east and swing around." I nodded, my mind already shifting from dinner to departure. The shift was always like this for me, a narrowing of focus, a quiet centering that made everything else fade. By the time the first runway lights came into view, my pulse had steadied into that familiar pre-flight rhythm. The gate recognized our car automatically, the metal arms lifting without pause. The tarmac stretched ahead, dotted with aircraft in varying stages of readiness, some tucked into hangars, others lined along the apron, their fuselages gleaming under floodlights. And there she was, the Pilatus PC-12, nose pointed toward the taxiway, door already open. Her white fuselage caught the light like porcelain, the silver stripe along her side a thin blade against the dark. As we pulled up, a ground crewman in a reflective vest waved us into position, his headset resting around his neck. I stepped out into the cool air, the faint tang of jet A fuel wrapping around me like an old memory. Jim was already speaking with the crew chief, their words short and efficient. I climbed the small set of stairs into the cabin. Inside, the soft hum of powered systems filled the space, the leather seats a warm contrast to the metal skin of the aircraft. I ran my hand along the edge of the seat as I passed, a small private ritual. Through the open door, I could see the restaurant lights far in the distance, just a scattering of gold against the dark. Somewhere in there, my brother was trying to make sense of the fact that I hadn't just left. I'd been collected, that the man who had walked into the restaurant wasn't a waiter or a driver but a pilot, that the plane waiting on the tarmac wasn't a prop for effect, but mine to command, and that I hadn't needed to say a word to prove any of it. Jim appeared at the door. "Ready?" I settled into my seat, fastening the belt across my lap. "Let's go." The door closed with a firm click, sealing out the night. As the engine started, the low growl building into a steady roar, I let my eyes drift to the window. The runway lights blurred slightly, the vibrations running through the fuselage settling into my bones. Up ahead, the pilot called for clearance. The tower's voice came through the intercom, calm and precise. "Cleared for takeoff. Runway 27. We rolled forward, the acceleration pressing me gently back into the seat. The lights rushed past, the nose lifted, and the ground fell away. Beneath us, the city stretched out in a grid of lights, and somewhere in that grid was a table where the conversation had stopped being about me years ago, and tonight had no choice but to be again. The first moments after takeoff are my favorite part of any flight. There's a split second where the wheels have just left the ground, the suspension still absorbing phantom bumps, and the body hasn't quite registered that the earth is falling away beneath it. Then the noise changes. The deep rumble of acceleration softens into the steadier hum of ascent, and the whole aircraft seems to exhale. Tonight, strapped into my seat, I let that transition wash over me. The runway lights dropped away, the city beyond them spreading like a constellation of amber and white. From up here, the roads were no more than faint threads between clusters of light, the noise of traffic replaced by the even drone of the engine. I leaned back, letting the vibration run through the cabin floor into my bones. My hands rested loosely in my lap, one thumb idly tracing the seam of the seatbelt. Jim's voice came over the intercom. "Smooth climb to 10,000. We'll level, check winds, and then push up to cruise. Should be an easy run tonight." "Copy," I said, though he hadn't really needed my acknowledgement. The truth was, he knew I liked hearing the checkpoints as much as giving them. It kept me anchored, reminded me that in the air, things made sense. There were rules, procedures, contingencies, and when something went wrong, you addressed it head on. You didn't pretend it hadn't happened. I wished family worked that way. The image of my brother sitting frozen at the table replayed in my mind, sharp in its detail. The fork halfway to his mouth, the subtle tightening around his eyes, the small crease that formed between his brows when the easy script he relied on no longer made sense. I hadn't planned to humiliate him. That wasn't the point. But there was a certain satisfaction in knowing I'd disrupted the narrative. For once, the version of me they carried around, the harmless, unremarkable sister they could dismiss with a shrug, had been replaced by something they couldn't immediately categorize. The thing about moments like that is they rarely land all at once. They stick in the mind, replaying over and over until the meaning starts to shift. By the time dessert hit the table back at Le Foyer, my brother would still be hearing Jim's voice in his head. "Ma'am, your plane is ready." I imagined the question starting even before they left the restaurant. Where was she going? What plane? Why was there a uniformed pilot involved? And why, for the first time in decades, had she left without explaining herself? The climb continued, the engine note deepening as we broke through a thin veil of cloud. The moonlight caught on the wingtip, silver and clean against the dark. Inside, the cabin lights were dimmed to a soft glow, casting long shadows across the upholstery. I reached for the small folder I'd tucked into the side pocket earlier. Inside were the supply manifests for the clinic run. A straightforward load tonight. Bandages, antibiotics, diagnostic kits, and a portable ultrasound unit that had taken weeks to source. The kind of cargo that didn't turn heads but changed lives once it reached its destination. Running my eyes over the list, I thought again of the dinner conversation. My mother asking if I was keeping busy. My father weighing me with that silent evaluation. Elaine's too smooth remark about not having the stress of a real job. They had no idea that in a few hours a rural doctor would open these crates and find tools that could diagnose a pregnancy complication, confirm a heart defect, or catch an infection before it turned fatal. And they never would, because I wouldn't tell them. Not because I was hiding it, but because I'd stopped trying to earn a kind of respect they weren't capable of giving. Jim's voice broke into my thoughts again. Leveling at 22,000, winds are steady out of the west, should give us a little push once we turn south. I glanced out the window. Below us, the clouds had thinned into scattered patches, the ground visible in soft, moonlit fragments. Here and there, tiny clusters of lights marked towns. Beyond them, nothing but dark fields and the occasional reflection off a winding river. It struck me that from this height, the world looked manageable. Problems were reduced to shapes and patterns, stripped of their noise. You could see where things connected, how they flowed together. If only conversations at my family's table worked that way. I closed the folder, sliding it back into the pocket. My mind was already moving ahead, to the landing, the offload, the turn back home. And somewhere between now and the next time I saw my brother, I knew there would have to be a different kind of landing. Not public, not for show, but in private, where the air was still and there was no audience. Because while I didn't need to defend myself to them, I also wasn't going to let them rebuild the same version of me they'd been using for years, the one they'd found so easy to dismiss. Number this time, the record would be corrected, quietly, permanently. The hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, and I let my eyes close for a moment. The vibration through the seat was comforting, familiar. Outside, The wingtip light blinked against the dark, each flash marking another few hundred feet closer to where I needed to be. We were making good time. The weather was holding. And somewhere behind us, in the warm glow of that restaurant, my brother was trying to reconcile the woman he thought I was with the one who had just been escorted out to a waiting aircraft. I almost smiled. Almost. The descent began just after midnight. Jim's voice came through the intercom again, low but steady. Beginning approach. Winds calm, runway lights in sight. I leaned forward slightly, peering out the side window. In the distance, a thin line of orange lights marked the landing strip, cutting through the darkness like a measured breath. Beyond it, nothing but shadow. The forest pressing in on all sides, the faint outline of hills against the horizon. We broke through the last stretch of cloud, and the familiar weight of descent settled in my stomach. It was a small airfield, the kind that had no control tower, just a windsock and a couple of people with flashlights ready to guide us in. The wheels touched down with a muted bump, the air brakes hissed, and the engines eased into a low idle. We taxied toward a single hangar at the far end. The metal walls gleamed under the floodlights, and in front of them, 3 people stood waiting. A man in a heavy canvas jacket, a young woman holding a clipboard, and a boy who couldn't have been more than 12, leaning against a dolly with his hands stuffed into his pockets. Jim cut the engines, and the sudden quiet was almost startling. I unbuckled, stepping down from the cabin with my bag slung over my shoulder. The night air here was colder, sharper. It smelled faintly of pine and something metallic, probably the hangar doors. The man stepped forward first. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice warm but tired. "Appreciate you coming through. The clinic's been out of half this stuff for weeks." "Let's get it unloaded," I replied, moving toward the cargo bay. Jim was already there, unfastening the straps that held the crates in place. The young woman, Lena, according to the tag on her jacket, checked each box against her list as the boy rolled them toward a waiting pickup. One crate was heavier than the rest, and when Jim slid it forward, the boy grunted with the effort of keeping it balanced on the dolly. I stepped in, bracing it from the other side until it was steady. He looked up at me then, wide-eyed but saying nothing, and I recognized that expression. It was the same one I'd seen on patients who'd just been told their test results were good. Quiet relief. The whole offload took less than 20 minutes. When the last box was secured, Lena signed the delivery sheet, tucking it into her clipboard. "This'll keep us going until the end of the month," she said. "The ultrasound unit will make the biggest difference. We've been guessing too often lately." I nodded. "That's why I wanted it here first." She smiled, but it faded quickly, replaced by a certain weariness. "You'd be surprised how many people don't think this kind of work matters." "I wouldn't," I said. "I've heard it all my life." The words came out quieter than I expected, but they weren't bitter, just factual. She gave me a searching look, as if she recognized the truth in them, then squeezed my arm lightly before turning to help the others with the pickup. As Jim refueled the plane, I walked a few steps away toward the edge of the airstrip. Out here, the night sky opened above us, unpolluted by city lights. The stars looked close enough to touch, and for a moment I let my head tip back, breathing in the stillness. This, right here, was the part my family didn't see. They saw the small apartment instead of the fact that I'd chosen it because it kept my costs low enough to fund flights like this. They saw my worn jacket instead of the fact that I'd worn it through storms over mountain ranges where there were no second chances if something failed. They saw dead weight where there was deliberate purpose, and that was fine. I wasn't here to convince them. Still, as the fuel pump clicked off and Jim signaled that we were ready, I thought about my brother again. The way he'd leaned back in his chair at dinner, smug until the moment the words, "Your plane is ready," had wiped the certainty from his face. He wasn't going to let that go, and I wasn't going to explain it away. We lifted off again just before 1 in the morning. The return leg was quieter, the air smooth, the moon a constant silver witness off our left wing. I sat in the co-pilot seat now, hands resting lightly on my knees, watching the instruments. Jim broke the silence once. "You thinking about the dinner?" I turned my head, met his eyes for a moment, then looked back at the panel. "I'm thinking about what comes next." He didn't push. He never did. The runway back home was empty when we landed. I helped with the last checks, then gathered my things, stepping down into the pre-dawn chill. My car was parked where I'd left it, a thin layer of frost on the windshield. As I drove through the sleeping streets toward my apartment, the events of the evening folded into two distinct halves. One, the heavy tablecloths and polished silverware of Le Foyer, the muted laughter over glasses of wine, the sidelong glances in my direction when my brother decided to make me the evening's target. Two, the clean night air at the airfield, the weight of crates in my hands, the quiet nod of thanks from a boy too young to know how much those supplies would matter. One half was noise, the other was purpose. And only one of them was worth my time. But family has a way of circling back. I knew my brother. He would try to confront me, not in front of others, but in private, where he could reassert the version of events that kept him comfortable. I'd be ready. This time, the conversation wouldn't be about defending myself. It would be about drawing a line so sharp it couldn't be crossed again. And if that meant shattering what little remained of the illusion that we were close, so be it. Because once you've flown above the noise, it's impossible to pretend it's the only world that exists. It was 2 days before he called, not texted, not emailed, called. I was in the middle of checking my flight log from the last run when the phone lit up with his name. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello? You busy?" His voice was tight, no casual preamble. "Always." There was a pause. "We need to talk. In person." I almost smiled. "We need to talk" was always his way of saying, I want to fix the story before it gets out of my control. "All right," I said. "Come by the hangar. You know where it is." He showed up half an hour later, dressed in the same sort of press shirt and sport coat he'd worn to dinner. His shoes were still polished. I doubted he'd ever stepped foot on an airstrip that wasn't for a vacation flight. He scanned the hangar as he walked in, eyes flicking over the stacks of equipment, the tool racks, the faint smell of aviation fuel that clung to the air. "You actually work here?" "No," I said, keeping my voice even. "I live here. This is just where I park my plane." The joke didn't land. He came to a stop a few feet from me, shoulders squared. "Look, about the other night." "You mean when you called me dead weight in front of 15 people? His jaw worked, but he didn't deny it. "It was a joke." "It was meant to land," I corrected. "And it did. Just not how you thought." He glanced around again as if trying to find a prop in the hangar to lean on, but there was nothing to shield him from the empty space between us. "You embarrassed me," he said finally. That made me laugh. Sharp, short. "You embarrassed yourself. All I did was stand up when the pilot said my plane was ready." His brow furrowed. "You own a plane?" "I own two. The one you saw that night and another I keep for parts. They're not luxury toys. They're tools. I use them for runs to places your kind of dinner crowd doesn't think about." He shifted uncomfortably. "Why wouldn't you just say that? People would understand." "Would they? Or would they nod politely and go right back to assuming I'm the family's charity case?" Silence stretched for a beat. Then, almost defensively, he said, "You've always been secretive." Hard to read. I stepped closer, not enough to threaten, but enough to make him feel the deliberate weight of my words. "I'm not secretive. I'm selective. There's a difference. And I learned a long time ago that some people, especially in this family, don't deserve to know what matters to me." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like he wasn't sure if there was a safe route forward. I gave him one. "The other night wasn't about me. It was about you needing a target so you could feel bigger in that room. I've seen it before, and I won't be standing in that spot again." "You're saying you're done?" "I'm saying I'm not your stage anymore." I turned slightly, gesturing toward the crates lined up against the hangar wall. These are going out tomorrow night. Medical supplies, textbooks, solar lanterns. They'll be loaded, flown, and in someone's hands before dawn. That's my dinner table. That's my guest list. He looked at them, but I don't think he really saw them. He was still trying to reconcile the version of me he'd built in his head with the one standing in front of him now. "You could have told me," he said finally, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "I could have," I agreed, "but you didn't earn it. And if that's something you can't live with, well, you'll survive." "I have." The words hung there for a moment, heavier than either of us expected. He took a slow step back, glancing toward the hangar door. "I should go?" "Probably." He paused before leaving. "You'll still come to the reception next month?" I studied him, weighing whether the question came from habit or hope. "If I do, it won't be to sit at your table." His mouth pressed into a line, but he didn't argue. He just nodded once and walked out, his footsteps fading against the concrete until the door shut behind him. The hangar felt even quieter after he left. I stood there a moment longer, letting the stillness settle back in. Outside, the light was already beginning to fade, and the scent of rain carried on the wind. I went back to the crates, checking the straps, tightening the ties. There was another run tomorrow, another landing strip in another place most people would never see, and there was work to be done before then. Family dinners could wait. Purpose couldn't. The next evening, the rain broke just before sunset. That meant clear skies for the night run. I'd already signed off on the weather brief, coordinated with ground teams, and checked the load manifest twice. 6 crates, medical supplies, water purification kits, and a box of children's books donated by a local library were secured in the back of the King Air. The hum of the hangar was steady, familiar. My crew moved with practiced efficiency, no wasted words. We didn't need them. Each of us knew our role. When the pilot came over, headset in hand, he gave me the same nod he always did. "Ready when you are, ma'am." That word, ma'am, never sounded condescending here. In this space, it was pure respect. I stepped toward the open hangar doors. Beyond them, the runway stretched out into a horizon streaked with the last light of day. The clouds were painted in bruised purples and golds, fading into the deepening blue of night. It hit me then. This was my real dining table. Not the one with crystal glasses and white linens, but this strip of tarmac where the stakes were real and the company knew exactly why we were here. We rolled the aircraft out. The sound of the engines warming was like a heartbeat, steady, strong. As the plane taxied to position, I thought about my brother's face that night at the restaurant. The confusion. The sudden quiet when he realized there was a version of me he'd never even imagined existed. I didn't need him to say he was wrong. The silence was enough. The first leg of the run went smooth. We climbed above a thin layer of cloud, the moonlight turning it silver. From the co-pilot's seat, I could see the map glowing on the console, our course marked by a thin green line stretching over hundreds of miles of dark earth. There's a particular kind of peace that comes with being in the air at night. It's not the absence of noise. There's still the hum of the engines, the occasional radio chatter, but a stripping away of everything that doesn't matter. Up there, no one cares about your place on a guest list. No one is measuring your worth by the number of people who laugh at your jokes over dinner. Up there, the only thing that matters is the mission. We touched down at a rural strip just past midnight. No terminal, no tower, just a lit-up stretch of asphalt carved out of the dark. 2 trucks waited at the edge of the runway, headlights cutting through the mist. The ground team moved fast. Crates were unloaded, checked, and reloaded onto the trucks. One driver waved as he climbed in, and I returned it, knowing he'd be heading toward a village that hadn't had reliable, clean water in months. This was what I wanted my legacy to be. Not the scraps of conversation that linger in some restaurant after the plates are cleared, but the tangible, measurable good that came from every flight. On the return trip, I leaned back in my seat and let my thoughts drift. Not to the insult at dinner, not to the years of being underestimated, but to all the times I'd quietly chosen my own runway. The truth was simple. My worth had never been theirs to grant, and no matter what they thought, I didn't live my life waiting for their permission. We landed just before dawn. The airfield was quiet, the horizon beginning to pale. I stepped down from the plane and inhaled the sharp morning air, feeling the cool bite of it in my lungs. The hangar lights glowed behind me, and for a moment I imagined what it would feel like if my brother stood there, seeing this part of my life for the first time. Maybe he'd understand. Or maybe he wouldn't. Either way, it wouldn't change a thing. By the time I locked up, the sun was cresting over the horizon. I walked to my truck, boots crunching over the gravel, and glanced back one last time at the hangar, at the plane, at the space that had become my refuge and my statement all at once. I didn't need a toast in my honor or a seat at anyone's head table. I had my own seat, one that faced forward with the sky in front of me and a mission waiting at the other end. I started the truck, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled out onto the empty road. Some people chase applause. I'd rather chase the horizon. That's how the story ends, not with their recognition, but with my own, because I learned a long time ago that the runway I choose is mine alone. And if that means they keep underestimating me, let them. They'll never hear the engines warming until it's too late.